On the 8th of February 1942, a silence hung over the Demyansk salient, which was shattered a few hours later by the roar of hundreds of aircraft engines. The Soviet troops of the Northwestern Front had just closed the ring around the 2nd Army Corps of the 16th German Army. Approximately 100,000 men were trapped in the pocket, 6 infantry divisions and part of the SS division Totenkopf. In Berlin, they were routinely preparing for another catastrophe. The catastrophe did not happen. Instead, a legend was born, the legend of the Demyansk Air Bridge, the first operation in the history of warfare that for months fed, armed, and treated an entire encircled army by air and pulled it out of the noose with almost no loss of territory. Later, this story would be referred to simply as the Demyansk Pocket. Exactly 1 year later, this same legend would become the main argument in the office where the fate of the 6th Army at Stalingrad would be decided. If Demyansk survived by air, then Paulus would survive too. A calculation that would cost Germany an entire army. The Demyansk Pocket stretched for almost 70 kilometers along the front line and encompassed an entire operational area with dozens of villages, forests, and the swampy floodplain of the Lovit River, rather than a compact bridgehead. This vastness made air supply an incomparably more difficult task than it appeared a year later in the eyes of the Berlin headquarters. To the south, several tens of kilometers from the Demyansk salient, the garrison of the town of Kulm held out in a much smaller encirclement, about 3,500 men under the command of Major General Theodor Scherer, supplied in the same way for 105 days, from January to May of 1942. It was on this smaller pocket that the German command first tested the very idea of supplying an encircled garrison by air, before extending it to the incomparably larger 2nd Army Corps. To understand how a local success on a secondary sector of the front turned into a deadly formula for the Wehrmacht's greatest catastrophe, one must return to where it all began, to the snows near Staraya Russa, where generals still considered encirclement a temporary nuisance, not a death sentence. January 1942. The Red Army was building on its success after defeating the Germans near Moscow. The troops of the Northwestern Front under the command of General Pavel Kurachkin were conducting the Toropets-Kulm offensive operation. And during this advance, Soviet divisions approached the Demyansk salient from 3 sides. The German command of Army Group North initially did not take the threat seriously. The salient was considered a rear area, a place for resting battle-weary units. The 2nd Army Corps under General Walter Graf von Brockdorff-Ahlefeldt was holding the defense here with the 12th, 30th, 32nd, 123rd, and 290th Infantry Divisions, as well as units of the SS Division Totenkopf. The shape of the Demyansk salient on the map resembled a huge wedge driven dozens of kilometers deep into the Soviet lines, and it was precisely this geometry that made the salient both a tempting target for encirclement and a convenient springboard for the German command, as the preserved salient tied down significant forces of the Soviet northwestern direction, preventing them from being freely transferred to other sectors of the Soviet German front. When the ring closed at Ramushevo on the 8th of February, the headquarters of the 16th Army under General Ernst Busch debated for several more days, to break out immediately or wait for help from above. Hitler decided the matter for them with one phrase, an order to hold their ground and not retreat a single step. Thus, the Demyansk salient became the first major pocket in the history of the Wehrmacht that the German command consciously decided not to abandon and not to attempt an immediate breakout. The local population of the Demyansk region, trapped inside the ring along with the German garrison, fell under the same requisitions of food and fodder as the troops. Archival documents of the 16th Army headquarters mention the seizure of livestock and grain from the remaining villagers as part of the plan to supply the encircled group, even before the air bridge reached its planned capacity. The Demyansk bridgehead was located at the junction of army groups north and center, and the loss of the salient could expose the flank of both army groups at once. It was this operational consideration, not just the fate of the Second Corps itself, that determined Hitler's insistence on holding the position. The operational group of the Northwestern Front that closed the ring advanced through the snowy forests and peat bogs of the Valdai Hills with almost no roads, which slowed the pace of the Soviet advance and gave the German garrison additional time to organize its defense. According to German data, the total strength of the encircled group fluctuated between 95 and 103,000 men during different months of the blockade, as aerial reinforcements and losses from combat and disease occurred simultaneously. The first days after the encirclement looked not like a well-oiled system, but like improvisation at the limit of possibility. There was no ground supply at all, and the command urgently threw into the air everything that could fly. Transport groups transferred from other sectors of the front, and crews pulled straight from flight schools. Air cover was provided by the 8th Air Corps, commanded at that time by General Wolfram von Richthofen. It was his fighters that for the first weeks kept Soviet aircraft away from the air corridors to the pocket. Only after several weeks did chaotic individual flights turn into an organized system with a schedule, dispatchers, and permanent forward airfields. In the very first days of the encirclement, the garrison was on the brink of catastrophe regarding ammunition. Artillery batteries received orders to fire only at confirmed targets and to conserve every shell, until transport groups like the 1st Special Duty Bomber Wing began operating on a stable schedule. Reconnaissance reports from the 16th Army headquarters in mid-February directly noted the risk that the garrison would run out of shells before the air bridge was established. Overall coordination of the supply effort was taken over by Colonel, later Major General, Fritz Morzik, who was tasked with turning the chaotic individual flights into a system with a single dispatch center. This experience later made him the Luftwaffe's chief expert on air bridges and led him to a similar position a year later at Stalingrad. The first organized convoy of transport groups took to the air on the 19th of February, 1942, 11 days after the ring closed, and until that date, supply was carried out by separate, sporadic flights without a unified schedule. Some urgent cargo, medicine, and ammunition for forward positions was dropped by parachute directly over the division positions, bypassing the airfield, which reduced delivery accuracy and led to the loss of part of the cargo in the forests and no man's land. The official version of this story later appeared short and beautiful. The 2nd Army Corps was encircled and did not perish. The Luftwaffe committed its transport aviation to the Demyansk salient, Junkers 52s, supplemented by Heinkel 111s and several Condor Focke-Wulf 200s, and for nearly 3.5 months, it supplied the garrison with everything necessary: ammunition, food, medicine, winter uniforms, even fresh horses for artillery teams. The wounded were evacuated on return flights, and replacements for those lost were delivered directly by air. By the beginning of May 1942, the ground corridor near the village of Ramushevo, the operation was codenamed Brückenschlag, meaning bridge building, connected the pocket with the main front, and the corps essentially ceased to be considered encircled. Goering reported to Hitler that the Luftwaffe had proven that an air-supplied fortress could hold out indefinitely, provided it had sufficient transport aircraft. Participants in the operation were decorated. Several transport group commanders were awarded the Knight's Cross. German propaganda dubbed the salient the Demyansk Fortress, and Demyansk entered military textbooks as an example of German organization and the superiority of technical thought over primitive encirclement tactics. The Central Party newspaper depicted the operation as proof that a German soldier was invincible, even in complete encirclement, if modern aviation stood behind him, and this image spread far beyond Germany. Even some foreign military observers of the time recognized the Demyansk operation as a model for the use of transport aviation in a positional deadlock. The main burden of transportation was borne by Special Combat Groups of Transport Aviation, KGRZBV 172, 500 and 700, later consolidated into a single transport command. The starting points were the airfields at Pskov, Relbitsy, and Glebovshchina, from which it was a flight of 40 to 90 kilometers to the Demyansk area. In good weather, the flight took 15 to 20 minutes, while in a blizzard or fog, it could stretch to an hour with the risk of getting lost over the continuous snow cover without ground landmarks. As a result of the operation, no fewer than 15 officers of transport and fighter aviation received the Knight's Cross, including several squadron commanders who flew daily alongside ordinary crews. According to official German data, an average of about 265 tons of cargo was delivered to the pocket daily, and on some days, over 300 tons. For comparison, this was enough to fully feed and arm a force the size of 6 divisions without land-based supply. In total, during the operation, over 65,000 tons of supplies were transported by air, about 35,000 wounded and sick were evacuated, and approximately 15,000 replacement personnel were delivered. It was these figures, replicated in staff reports and picked up by the press, that would soon begin to live a life of their own, far more destructive than the operation itself. The operation peaked in March and April of 1942, when up to 150 transport aircraft took to the air simultaneously each day, and the total aircraft fleet involved in the operation, accounting for replacement crews and machines, exceeded 500 units. The record day for volume was the 20th of April when, according to German data, over 350 tons of cargo were delivered to the pocket in a single day, the absolute maximum for the entire operation. One standard Junkers 52 carried just over 2 tons of cargo, or up to 12.5 wounded on the return flight. Behind the scenes, this beautiful picture looked completely different. The Luftwaffe's transport aviation was not a bottomless conveyor belt. It was a thin, constantly snapping thread that Soviet fighter aviation and anti-aircraft artillery cut at every opportunity. To scrape together the necessary number of aircraft, the command pulled transport groups from literally all fronts, and which proved especially costly later, took a significant portion of training crews from flight schools, people who were being prepared for future operations, not for flights under anti-aircraft fire in the frontline zone. The staging airfields near Pskov and Riga operated at their limit. Crews flew 2 to 3 sorties a day in any weather because the pocket could not wait for good visibility. Some of the crews thrown into the operation were cadets in their final year of training at the Grossenhain and Finsterwald flight schools, who completed their training right on the route, combining combat sorties with minimal instruction. It was this category of pilots that accounted for the largest share of incidents not related to enemy fire. Weather reports from the 16th Army headquarters recorded for February and March no fewer than 20 days with completely non-flying weather out of the 60 days of that period. For almost a third of the time, the operation was essentially idle, and the entire supply schedule depended on compensation during the remaining flying days. The Junkers landed at Demyansk airfield under fire. The dirt strip was targeted by artillery from the surrounding heights, and every landing was a separate lottery. Frosts of 30 and 40 degrees froze the oil in the engines right on the parking stands. Mechanics had to warm up the engines with blowtorches before every sortie, and icing on the corrugated skin of the Junkers created an additional load that the aircraft's designers in peacetime had never even considered. Crews of the transport groups flew for months without proper rotation, with 2 to 3 combat sorties a day, and crew fatigue itself became a cause of accidents on landing no less often than ground fire. Major General Fritz Morzik, responsible for the entire transport operation, wrote directly in a post-war report for American military history. Crews lost aircraft not so much in air combat as during takeoff and landing under artillery fire on worn-out muddy strips. The Demyansk strip was expanded and reinforced twice during the 3.5 months of the operation by engineer battalions attached to the 12th and 30th Infantry Divisions, who also used captured Red Army soldiers for the heavy labor. The mat of logs and metal airfield plates withstood up to 100 movements of transport aircraft on some days, whereas without this reinforcement, the ground of the spring thaw simply could not have endured such intensity. Inside the pocket itself, life bore little resemblance to the favorable picture from headquarters reports. Despite the claimed 200 to 300 tons of daily supply, during periods of non-flying weather, and the winter on the Valdai gave blizzards for weeks on end, the garrison subsisted on reduced rations for weeks. Hospitals inside the pocket were overflowing with frostbite and typhus long before it was dared to be written in official reports, and the shortage of fodder forced the slaughter of a significant portion of the artillery horses. The outbreak of typhus in the spring of '42 incapacitated no fewer than several thousand people simultaneously, and field hospitals designed for a short-term influx of the wounded proved unprepared for a protracted epidemic under conditions of overcrowding and a shortage of clean water. The evacuation of the wounded on return flights saved tens of thousands of lives. But in exactly the same way, the return flights meant that every aircraft carrying the wounded was an aircraft that was not delivering ammunition to the front line at that moment. According to German medical reports, over 17,000 cases of frostbite of varying severity passed through the field hospitals inside the pocket during the blockade, and the typhus outbreak in March and April claimed, by various estimates, from 1,500 to 2,000 lives directly from the disease, not counting those weakened by it who later died from other causes. The daily bread ration for enlisted personnel during certain weeks of February and March dropped to 150 grams per person, less than half the standard Wehrmacht field ration, and the garrison command officially recorded this as an emergency measure. The ground corridor at Ramushevo, which was finally breached in late April and early May, turned out to be no life-saving artery but a narrow, shell-swept gap several kilometers wide, squeezed between two Soviet groupings. The soldiers simply called it the Corridor of Death. Supply columns moving along this corridor came under flanking artillery fire almost every kilometer of the road. The bridge over the Lovit River in the Ramushevo area was destroyed and rebuilt several times under fire. According to the war diary of the 16th Army, the command committed the fresh 5th and 8th Jaeger divisions, withdrawn from the relatively quiet Norwegian sector, to breaking through this corridor, and spent almost a month of stubborn fighting on the operation instead of the planned week. German losses in just the first weeks of fighting for the corridor exceeded 3,000 men killed, a resource torn from the General Reserve of Army Group North to hold a secondary salient that had no strategic value other than prestige. Soldiers' letters preserved in field post archives describe the corridor not as a tactical success, but as an endless meat grinder, where each new replacement company melted away without visible result, because Soviet artillerymen knew every meter of that road by heart and kept it under constant aimed fire from the surrounding heights. The width of the Ramushevo corridor at the peak of the fighting did not exceed 4 to 6 kilometers, and at the crossing over the Lovit it narrowed to 2.5 kilometers of space swept by fire from end to end. The operation to break through the corridor, launched on the 21st of March 1942, officially concluded only on the 5th of May, almost a month and a half of fighting instead of the planned week. The 5th Jaeger Division, thrown into these battles, lost almost a quarter of its personnel in the first month, and the 8th Jaeger Division slightly less, which shows how underestimated the density of the Soviet defense in this sector was initially. American historian David Glantz, one of the few Western researchers to have analyzed in detail the fighting in the northwestern sector of the Soviet-German front, noted in his works that the Demyansk operation cost the Soviet side no less heavily. The attempts by the Northwestern Front to cut off the salient and sever the Ramushevo corridor in the spring and summer of '42 cost the Red Army enormous losses for minimal progress. The front never managed to close the ring again until the Germans' voluntary withdrawal in early '43. In his book on the battles for the Demyansk salient, Glantz indicated that the total losses of the Northwestern Front in operations against the salient for the entire 1942 amounted, by various estimates, from 90 to 130,000 men killed, wounded, and captured, meaning the Soviet side, in absolute numbers, paid for the failed attempt to cut off the salient roughly as much as the entire encircled German grouping numbered. In the summer and autumn of 1942, the front made at least 2 more major attempts to cut off the salient, in July and in late August, and both ended without significant change to the front line. Declassified post-war loss reports paint a far less celebratory picture than the reports Goering brought to Hitler. During the Demyansk air operation, the Luftwaffe lost about 262 Junkers 52 transport aircraft, almost as many as were committed to the operation at one time. Over 500 flight crew members perished, trained, experienced transport aviation pilots and navigators, who later could not be physically replaced. The chief of staff of the Luftwaffe, General Hans Jesenek, who had reported to Goering and Hitler about the real capabilities of transport aviation even before the Demyansk operation, later, during the Stalingrad catastrophe, found himself essentially a hostage to his own former optimism. And according to the testimony of post-war German researchers, the burden of responsibility for both air bridges, Demyansk and Stalingrad, became one of the causes of his deep mental crisis in 1943. Let us isolate this figure and repeat it once more, because it usually gets lost in general talk of triumph. 262 transport aircraft. 262. This is more than Germany managed to assemble to supply Demyansk simultaneously at the peak moment of the operation. The Luftwaffe essentially burned a significant portion of its transport fleet to hold a secondary front salient near Staraya Russa. And this bill would have to be paid on a completely different sector of the war, when transport aircraft would be insufficient to supply the corps in Tunisia in 1943. By the time of the official conclusion of the operation, the Luftwaffe's transport aviation had lost almost a third of its original fleet of Junkers 52s on the Eastern Front. Losses which the production capacities of the factories in Dessau and Bremen had failed to replenish by the beginning of 1943, as the aviation industry produced no more than 130 new machines of this type per month. It was this gap in the transport aircraft fleet, and not just distance and weather, that became one of the hidden causes of the failure of the Stalingrad air bridge 10 months later. It is here that the actual Demyansk story ends and its darkest chapter begins, the one that happened almost 1,000 kilometers to the south and 10 months later. In late November 1942, General Friedrich Paulus's Sixth Army found itself encircled at Stalingrad by forces of the Soviet counteroffensive. At the headquarters meeting, the question immediately arose: to break out immediately while the ring was not yet strong, or to be supplied by air and hold the position, awaiting a relief strike. By this point, Hitler and Goering had no alternative example of air supply for an encircled force other than Demyansk. The Tunisian bridgehead had not yet had time to reveal its own supply problems, and the earlier experience at Kulm was considered too small-scale to serve as an independent argument. And here, Goering uttered the phrase that entered all post-war studies of the disaster at Stalingrad. The Luftwaffe was capable of supplying an encircled force by air, as it had already done at Demyansk. Hitler seized upon this argument as a ready-made solution. The chief of the General Staff of the Army, General Kurt Zeitzler, warned that airlifting the required volume of supplies for a force of such scale was physically impossible with the existing fleet of transport aircraft, and he cited precisely the Demyansk figures as an indicator of the limit of capabilities. Yet this very limit was heard in the headquarters exactly the opposite way, as proof that no limit existed. Paulus sent telegram after telegram to headquarters, requesting permission for an independent breakout while the ring was not yet fully solidified. But each time he received in response a reminder of the Demyansk precedent and an order to hold. The order was unambiguous: hold. The Sixth Army would be supplied by air, just as the Second Army Corps had been earlier. The Chief of Staff of the Sixth Army, General Arthur Schmidt, later recalled that the Demyansk analogy sounded in headquarters almost like a ready-made formula, repeated mechanically at every meeting, and attempts by staff officers to point out the difference in the scale of the two pockets met with irritated repetition of the same argument. The Luftwaffe had already proven its capability, and to doubt this was almost disloyal. The problem lay in the arithmetic, which headquarters preferred not to examine seriously. The Demyansk Pocket contained about 100,000 men and required on average about 265 tons of supplies per day. The Stalingrad Pocket contained almost 2.5 times more people, approximately 250,000, and by the most modest estimates required no less than 500 tons daily just to avoid starvation, not to mention ammunition to continue fighting. Demyansk was supplied from airfields located within an hour's flight, over territory where Soviet fighters appeared sporadically, and anti-aircraft fire was moderate.
Stalingrad was supplied from Salsk and Tatsinskaya, hundreds of kilometers away, in the midst of a frosty winter, under almost continuous fire from Soviet fighter aviation and anti-aircraft artillery.
which by that time already qualitatively and quantitatively surpassed that which had flown over Demyansk a year earlier. Even the transport base itself was not comparable. At Demyansk, the Luftwaffe maintained a dense network of forward airfields in the near rear and relatively fresh crews, whereas at Stalingrad, transport groups flew from the airfields of Salsk and Tatsinskaya, which were several times farther from the pocket, and the crews by that time were already exhausted by a year of continuous combat operations in the east. Simultaneously with the attempt to supply Stalingrad, the German command tried to maintain supply for the forces in the Kuban and Crimea, dispersing the same depleted fleet of transport aircraft across several directions at once. There simply remained no reserve accumulated after the Demyansk operation for this purpose. Besides infantry, the Stalingrad Ring contained the headquarters of 2 army and 1 tank corps, numerous rear and artillery units with their own stock of horses and equipment, which required fuel and fodder in volumes incomparable to the Demyansk garrison. According to approximate calculations by the headquarters of Army Group Don, just the minimal fodder allowance for the baggage horses required an additional over 40 tons of cargo daily, an expenditure that hardly figured in the Demyansk calculations, since the number of horses in the smaller pocket was many times lower. The actual figures of the Stalingrad air bridge proved catastrophic precisely because the Demyansk experience created an illusion of repeatability. Instead of the required 500 tons per day, transport aviation in the best days delivered about 100, and on average, significantly less. During the Stalingrad operation, the Luftwaffe lost over 480 transport and converted combat aircraft, almost twice as many as during all the months of the Demyansk operation, including machines withdrawn from other directions and thrown into the furnace of a clearly doomed supply effort. In mid-December, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein attempted to break through a corridor to the encircled forces with Operation Winter Storm, and the tank divisions of General Kirchner's 47th Tank Corps halted within a few tens of kilometers of the pocket. The relief attack stalled, and Paulus, remembering the Demyansk example and awaiting the promised air supply, never dared to attempt an independent breakout without Hitler's direct permission. The Sixth Army capitulated at the end of January and beginning of February 1943. About 91,000 men fell into Soviet captivity, and of them, only a few thousand returned home to Germany after the war, the remnants of a once powerful army, torn from Germany's history at the cost of one deceptive analogy, which sounded convincing only because it had been reported with pride a year earlier. On the 24th of December 1942, the Soviet Tank Corps of General Vasily Badanov raided the Tatsinskaya airfield, from which a significant portion of the Stalingrad transport flights originated, and destroyed on the ground, according to various estimates, from 70 to over 100 transport aircraft simultaneously, a loss which the fleet, already depleted by the Demyansk operation, could no longer replenish. After this raid, the pace of supply for the Stalingrad pocket fell by almost a third compared to previous weeks, and was not restored until the very capitulation. Major General Morzik himself, the very man who organized the Demyansk air bridge and later described in detail the experience of German transport operations for American military historians, subsequently directly pointed out, the Demyansk success created a dangerous illusion of universality in the high command. Although the conditions of the two operations were incomparable in scale, supply distance, and level of enemy air supremacy. He probably understood the difference between these two pockets better than anyone else in the Wehrmacht, and it was precisely the Demyansk experience, distorted and simplified into one convenient phrase, that became the very argument used to make a decision that resulted in the destruction of an entire army. In his final report for the U.S. Army, Morzik drew a direct comparison of two operations across 6 parameters: the number of encircled troops, daily tonnage requirement, flight distance, level of fighter aviation resistance, airfield condition, and weather conditions. And by each of these, the Demyansk operation proved many times easier than Stalingrad, making the direct transfer of experience, in his own words, a methodological error of the highest order. Already after the Stalingrad surrender, German memoirists and staff historians long tried to explain the catastrophe by anything other than a direct command decision. The weather, overstretched supply lines, the heroism of the enemy, and they recalled far less often that it was precisely the Demyansk precedent that gave the high command the psychological right to risk an entire army instead of a timely withdrawal. This selective memory itself became part of the post-war myth of Demyansk. First, a textbook operation, then an unfortunate confluence of circumstances at Stalingrad, as if no direct causal link existed between them, a link recorded in those very staff documents. After the war, former Wehrmacht staff officers, including Major General Morzik himself, took part in preparing a series of studies for the U.S. Army on the experience of German transport operations on the Eastern Front. For decades, these documents became the primary source of information on the Demyansk airlift for Western military historians. And in them, the authors naturally had an interest in presenting the operation as a model of German transport aviation professionalism, rather than as a link in the chain of decisions that led to the Stalingrad catastrophe. This is why, in Western military historiography of the Cold War, the Demyansk episode was analyzed for many years almost exclusively as a technical logistics success, and only later researchers who consulted both Soviet and German archival documents simultaneously restored the full picture of the interconnection between the two cauldrons. German studies from the 1960s and 1970s, before the opening of Soviet archives, relied almost exclusively on captured documents and the Wehrmacht's own staff records, so the Soviet side of the operation, losses, forces committed, repeated attempts to cut off the salient, remained almost entirely undescribed until works appeared that made use of the Ministry of Defense archives in the post-Soviet period. The Germans held the Demyansk salient until mid-February of 1943, and then voluntarily abandoned it during an organized withdrawal under the codename Operation Zeppelin, fearing a repetition of the Stalingrad scenario on this sector of the front. Formally, the operation at Demyansk remained in Wehrmacht history as an example of exemplary supply for an encircled grouping. Informally, it became the first link in a chain of decisions that, a year later, led to the annihilation of an entire army on the Volga. The Ramushevo corridor of death, which cost the German division so many lives to hold a secondary salient, ultimately saved nothing fundamental. It only bought Germany a few months' reprieve and one very costly illusion. During the withdrawal under Plan Zeppelin, the 16th Army evacuated almost all heavy equipment and supplies from the salient, losing, according to German data, less than 5% of its materiel, a stark contrast to the equipment and gear abandoned by the surrendered 6th Army at Stalingrad. Today, the battles at Demyansk are commemorated by military memorials and museum exhibits in Staraya Russa and the Demyansk district of Novgorod Oblast, where annual remembrance events are held on the anniversaries of the encirclement and the breaking of the ring, while search teams still recover from the earth the remains of the fallen on both sides and the wreckage of transport aircraft that crashed on takeoff and landing in the winter of 1942. One successful airlift proved to the German generals that supplying a cauldron by air was possible in principle. It did not prove under what conditions this was possible, and it was precisely this difference that no one in Berlin cared to take seriously. Legends of victories are dangerous, not because they lie about the past. They are dangerous because they are mindlessly applied to the future.